How can one draw closer to the Prophet without increasing ritual actions, without adding new devotional practices, and without intensifying outward imitation? For many believers, closeness to the Prophet is assumed to be primarily behavioral or historical. It is measured by how accurately one copies external actions or how emotionally attached one feels to a distant past. This assumption, however, rests on a subtle but critical misunderstanding. It treats closeness as spatial, temporal, or performative. Ibn Arabi offers a fundamentally different framing. In his metaphysical psychology, closeness is not a matter of physical proximity or historical reenactment. It is ontological and perceptual. It concerns how consciousness itself is structured, how meaning is perceived, how intention is formed, and how reality is interpreted. The central thesis of this lecture is this: drawing inwardly closer to the Prophet means aligning one's inner architecture of perception, attention, and intention with what Ibn Arabi calls the Muhammadan reality, al-Eq, ka, almu, Ahmadiyya. This is not about doing more, but about seeing differently. Interestingly, this insight resonates strongly with modern psychology. Contemporary research consistently shows that identity, attention, and meaning-making shape behavior far more deeply than surface actions alone. What you perceive determines how you act long before conscious choice enters the picture. To understand why this teaching matters today, we must first examine the modern psychological condition. Contemporary life is characterized by chronic stress, attentional fragmentation, and persistent identity confusion. You are exposed to more information, more comparison, and more stimulation than any previous generation. Yet this abundance comes at a cost. From a cognitive standpoint, constant cognitive overload reduces self-regulation. When mental resources are depleted, ethical consistency weakens. Neuroscience shows that under stress, the brain defaults to reactive patterns rather than reflective judgment. There is also a well-documented negativity bias. The human brain prioritizes threats over meaning. This leads to emotional dysregulation, anxiety, and a constant sense of insufficiency. At the neural level, excessive dominance of the default mode network, the system associated with self-referential thought, produces rumination and ego-centered interpretation of reality. Spiritually, the consequence is profound. Human beings lose connection with exemplars of meaning, prophets, sages, and ethical archetypes. Religious practice may continue, but it becomes habitual rather than transformative. Ritual remains, but inner coherence erodes. The issue, then, is not lack of belief or lack of action. It is misalignment between inner perception and higher models of consciousness. Without that alignment, even sincere practice fails to reshape character at this point. Ibn Arabi enters the discussion not as a poet of mystical ecstasy, but as a rigorous metaphysician and psychologist of consciousness, living in Al-Andalus. Ibn Arabi authored monumental works such as Al-Fatah, al-Makiwa, and Fu al-Ikam. His system is often misunderstood as symbolic or purely mystical. But this is a serious misreading. In reality, Ibn Arabi constructs an internally consistent metaphysical framework based on hierarchy, correspondence, and epistemology. Reality, in his view, unfolds through levels of manifestation, each level reflecting divine meaning with varying degrees of completeness. Within this structure, the Prophet represents the most complete configuration of human consciousness. Not merely ethically exemplary, but ontologically comprehensive. Therefore, drawing close to the Prophet does not mean copying isolated behaviors. It means restructuring one's inner faculties' perception, intention, attention so that they correspond to this most complete human form. Closeness, in Ibn Arabi's system, is correspondence of structure. What, then, is al-Aqqa al-Muhammadiyya? It is not the historical body of the Prophet, nor a metaphorical exaggeration. It is the universal template of perfected human awareness, the form through which divine meaning is most fully expressed. Ibn Arabi's logic is precise. God manifests meanings through forms. Among all human forms, the Prophet is the most comprehensive vessel for divine attributes such as mercy, justice, wisdom, and balance. In modern terms, this resembles but exceeds the concept of a cognitive archetype. Jung spoke of archetypes as inherited patterns shaping perception. Cognitive science speaks of schemas, internal models that organize experience and guide behavior. When your inner schema is fragmented, actions become inconsistent and reactive. When your schema aligns with a coherent archetype, behavior harmonizes naturally. Consider two people performing the same ethical act. One does so reactively, driven by guilt or social pressure. The other acts with calm intent. Externally, the action appears identical. Internally, the structure of consciousness is entirely different. Closeness to the Prophet, therefore, is not emotional attachment or historical nostalgia. It is structural similarity of consciousness. This brings us to a critical distinction in Ibn Arabi's thought. Tackled, defesses da akuk. Tackled is imitation, copying external behavior without internal comprehension. Tawak is realization, embodying underlying principles through understanding. Imitation without realization produces rigidity. Internalization produces adaptability and wisdom. Cognitive science mirrors this distinction. Rule-based behavior relies on surface compliance. Value-based cognition integrates principles at the level of identity. Neuroscientifically, this corresponds to prefrontal integration, allowing ethical reasoning to adapt across contexts to imitate the Prophet emotionally or behaviorally without grasping governing principles. Mercy, balance, restraint leads to inflexibility. To internalize those principles produces ethical intelligence. Take emotional regulation as an example. The Prophet was not emotionally suppressed, but emotionally contained. Modern psychology shows that emotional granularity, the ability to understand and regulate emotion, improves decision-making and social trust. Drawing closer, then, means operating from the same governing principles, not replicating context-specific actions. Ibn Arabi places extraordinary emphasis on should witnessing. Spiritual growth, in his view, is not accumulation of information, but refinement of attention. The Prophet exemplifies complete presence with God and with creation simultaneously. Neuroscience confirms that attention bias determines emotional tone and moral salience. What you attend to becomes meaningful. Mindfulness research consistently shows that attentional stability reduces impulsivity and increases ethical consistency. Where attention goes, meaning consolidates. The Prophet's inward closeness to God produced outward clarity with people. He responded rather than reacted. He perceived context before judgment in conflict. The difference between reactivity and responsiveness is attentional training. One is ego-driven. The other is reality-oriented. Inward closeness emerges when attention is trained toward truth rather than self-reinforcement. In Ibn Arabi's framework, love is not sentimentality. It is recognition of correspondence. You love what reflects your deepest reality. Love is ontological alignment, not emotional intensity. Modern psychology parallels this through values-based identity formation. When goals are self-unconcordant, aligned with core values, motivation becomes stable and sustainable. Love for the Prophet manifests not as emotional excess, but as ethical consistency, cognitive humility, and willingness to be corrected. Emotional attachment without transformation is psychologically unstable. Ontological alignment produces resilience. Several paradoxes now resolve themselves. First, how can one be close to the Prophet without seeing him? Because closeness is qualitative, not sensory. Second, why can knowledge increase arrogance? Ibn Arabi explains that knowledge without self-knowledge inflates the ego rather than refines it. Third, why does spiritual practice sometimes increase anxiety? Because effort without understanding creates internal dissonance. Ibn Arabi does not reject law or ritual. He situates them within conscious integration, translated into modern practice. This framework becomes concrete. Reflective intention setting clarifies values. Attentional training cultivates non-reactive awareness. Ethical self-auditing ensures consistency between belief and behavior. Cognitive, behavioral therapy restructures thought patterns. Acceptance and commitment therapy aligns behavior with values. Neuroscience confirms that repeated attention reshapes neural pathways. This is gradual psychological repatterning, not instant. Spirituality, drawing inwardly closer to the Prophet, is a reconfiguration of perception, attention. An identity, Ibn Arabi offers a rational, structured model of spiritual psychology, one that remains profoundly relevant. The Prophet is not only to be remembered, but understood as a living standard of human consciousness. True closeness is measured not by emotion or imitation, but by how one sees, chooses, and responds to reality.